we go. So if you have logged on for the DCIA Zoom forum on the anniversary of George Floyd's death, you have found the right place. I do want to invite you all, as you log on, to please introduce yourself in the chat, share your name and the faith community or the organization that you are part of, and we will welcome that sharing as part of our connecting with each other today. I do want to invite everyone, as you log on, as we continue to have some new folks log on now, to please mute yourself. We will have a time later in the meeting for some questions and conversation with our panelists, but we do want you to, for the sake of our shared time together, please do mute yourself. I was giving orientation to my mom in her 80s yesterday on using Zoom for some meetings that she's been invited to. One of the things I emphasized to her was get in the habit of muting yourself when you're not talking. Your fellow attenders will appreciate it. So my name is Spencer Bradford. I'm the director of Durham Congregations in Action, and welcome you all here today to this forum. I'm going to share the text of our DCIA affirmation, the reading of which together we do use at most of our gatherings, and want to introduce our president, Gordon Whitaker, who will lead us in that reading while the rest of you are muted, so that you can hear his voice and join in and hear your voice, but just on your end. Gordon?
Thank you, Spencer. Welcome, everyone. This is the time of the day when we usually have our DCIA assemblies in person over some lunch, and we hope we'll be able to resume those in not too many more months. So as we begin this DCIA assembly, let's together reaffirm our DCIA purpose. And someone's not muted.
Sorry.
Everyone mute, please. Otherwise we'll make a racket, a joyful noise with each other.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Okay, ready? Here we go. In the spirit of reconciliation and with gratitude for the gift of diversity, DCIA seeks to educate, engage, and empower people of faith to create a community of justice and peace through our common prayers and acts of compassion, and with prophetic courage to act as advocates for the dignity and well-being of all persons, recognizing that behind every human face is the face of God. Thank you for being with us today. And now I'd like to introduce Reverend Donna Banks, pastor of McMahon UMC, United Methodist Church. And Donna is going to lead us in our program today. Donna, thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Excited that we are all here to have a conversation. And we've invited a couple of people to share their journey over the last year. I currently serve at McMahon United Methodist Church in Durham. And we have all been, as you all have, as we've been dealing with a pandemic, we've also been dealing with two viruses, the virus of COVID-19 as well as the virus of racism. And I might add a virus of white supremacy. And over this last year, DCIA, I also serve on the board at DCIA with Gordon and with Spencer, as we have begun a conversation of what it meant just to build the beloved community. While the work is anti-racism, the work of the church is always to build something better. And not just our churches, but our synagogues and our temples and all of our places of worship. We're looking to build something better. And so we have engaged in the work of building the beloved community. And it's our work, it says that we are to bring Durham together through relationships, trust, and actions. Because we all come from diverse backgrounds and experiences, we have many talents and gifts. And we believe that dialogues about race can help us to come together in relationships that nurture authentic unity for a changed future. And so we hope to develop trust across barriers that separate us, and together we can work effectively and genuinely for each other's well-being and for the common good. So that gives you an idea of where we've been. And Joe Harvard and I have agreed to chair this group and have these discussions. So we've been making our way through having some discussions each month as our assembly, since we can't meet in person, but to have these different discussions. And add to that end, we've also added an opportunity for churches to be in relationship with each other. So if you, for some reason, would like to be a part of a relationship, when I think of the work of anti-racism, I think of it in like 4 phases. There's an awareness stage, acknowledgement that something's just not quite right. The second thing is there's an education phase. And then there's a phase of relationship. And then there's a phase of advocacy. I apologize, but it's everybody may be in different places in this whole process. So we're inviting you into different phases of that. We are inviting you to acknowledgement, we're inviting you to advocacy, inviting you to relationship. We have just recently started a relationship between Trinity Avenue Presbyterian Church and White Rock Baptist Church. And so we have brought them together, and now they're moving forward with in the relationship stage of hearing from each other in order they can figure out what they're being called to do. So if you're interested in any of in being a part of a relationship with a church that looks different from you in any way, shape, or form, please do not hesitate to contact Brad or anybody on the DCIA board. Today, though, as we begin our time, I'm gonna take you back to March 25th, 2020. Mm-hmm. It was an ordinary day when a Black man was enjoying a holiday evening in Minneapolis. And we find that a Minneapolis police officer pressed his knee onto his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, which sparked a national movement. On April 20th, 2020, the former police officer, Derek Chauvin, was found guilty in all 3 counts related to his killing of George Floyd. And the jury verdict was unanimous. Chauvin's attorney, as we see in the last couple of days, has filed a motion for a new trial, citing jury misconduct, witness intimidation, and impact of publicity. So today, we sit here in the midst of ever-changing world to have a conversation of what these turn of events have had on our congregations and on each one of us. Today, we have 4 people who are serving congregations, and I will introduce them, and I'll let them introduce themselves as well. Reverend Dr. Mindy Douglas, who serves as the pastor of First Presbyterian. We have Iman Abdul Wahid, who is a part of the Duke Center for Muslim Life. Rabbi Matt Soffer, who's at Judeo Reform Congregation, and Rector Stephanie Yancey at St. Titus Episcopal. So we are glad that you all are here. And we'll invite them to give us about 8 to 10 minutes of their interpretation and what has been happening to them and their congregations over the last year. And then we will be opening it up for questions from you. So we invite you to go ahead and put your questions in the chat in order that we can be ready to have those conversations when they become available. we will again open it up. I think the best part of our time together is the question and answer. So we want to leave at least a good amount of time for that. But before we get started, I invite us to a time of silence as we invite ourselves to be open to what we may hear, but also in recognition of the death of George Floyd. So I invite you to a time of silence.
You're still chirping.
Amen. So we are gonna go alphabetical to make it easier on me and easier on to keep up with who goes next. And so we invite Mindy Douglas to offer her her interpretation of what has been happening within her, for her and her congregation. Mindy.
Thank you so much, Donna. Wow. Hello, friends. Hello, everyone. I wish we were all in a big room together, but I'm happy to see many of your faces, the ones that I can see, and I'm happy to be with you today. It is really an honor to be a part of this panel of justice workers and faith leaders, and I know many of you all could be in this seat, and so I hope that that what I say today represents some of the churches that that aren't speaking today. But so, Donna, you've already said a year ago, we were only 2 months into the COVID-19 pandemic when George Floyd was murdered, his breath taken away by a police officer kneeling on his neck. The whole world saw it. And it was as if a veil of denial was lifted from eyes and hearts and minds, and no longer could so many whites continue to deny the unjustified, unethical, and immoral violence of police officers against unarmed Black bodies. People of all races began to march and protest, and even previously silent white people began to talk about white supremacy, white and systemic racism in ways they never had before.
Okay, I'll come to the door when you do. See you in a bit.
At First Presbyterian Church in downtown Durham, racial justice work is not a new calling for us. For decades, our church leaders have been connected to the community, working for civil rights in the 60s, for school integration, for fair housing policies, for educational equity. And I could go on, and certainly my predecessor and friend Joe Harvard could tell you story after story of how First Presbyterian has lived into our belief that all people are made in God's image, and how we've worked for and longed for God's beloved community to be fully present in Durham. And all of this history has been important. It's been critical even for our formation as a church that seeks to love God and love neighbor. But George Floyd's death taught us something. It has not been enough. Our calling now is to use our voices, our hands, our feet, our minds, and our hearts to claim and confess. And this is what we realized so clearly a year ago, to confess our own participation in a racist system that permeates every part of our lives and our nation. We have to address the racist undergirding of every system that we know: criminal justice, education, housing, employment, and yes, even religious systems. We have to ask about wealth disparities and opportunity gaps between the races. We have to ask the hard questions of ourselves, our congregation, our denomination, and our community over and over and over again. So 1 year ago, when this happened, we were already planning a summer book study of a book on reparations, From Here to Equality, by local authors. Many of you know Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen. Our friends at Judea Reform joined us as we discussed weekly the history and sin of racism in the United States. This was not the first book on the history of racial injustice in the US we had read together as a community, nor would it be the last. but it was the first time we spent that much time talking about reparations. And George Floyd's death made those conversations louder and bolder than they had ever been before. George Floyd's murder did not necessarily change the direction of our anti-racist work, but it changed the intensity. What had been a nice drive through the country became a drag race through the middle of the city. His murder lifted our voices and changed our rhetoric. In our preaching, prayers, and worship, the words white supremacy, white privilege, and systemic racism, among others, were spoken more frequently than ever before. Racial equity was no longer one of many issues. It became the issue that we all talked about in every worship service, at committee meetings and book discussions and Zoom gatherings, and as we marched together. In our work for fair housing and reduced evictions, racial equity was the theme. In our work to alleviate food insecurity, racial equity was the theme. In our work to provide assistance to those most affected by COVID-19, racial equity was the theme. In our work in criminal justice reform, racial equity was the theme. Floyd's murder and the killing of others like Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor were grieved by white and brown and Black families alike in our congregation. And now, so close in Elizabeth City, we are witnesses to the injustice of another killing of an unarmed Black man by police. And we grieve the death of Andrew Brown because he is our brother, and we march, protest, and demand justice for his family. I could share a lot here. A lot more about what we are doing at FBC, about what our sister predominantly white congregations, Presbyterian, Methodist, Episcopal, Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Baptist, UCC, UU, and other Christian churches are doing in Durham, what our Presbyterian denomination is doing, what the North Carolina Council of Churches is doing, and how much more still needs to be done. We must continue to work across racial, economic, and religious lines. We must build stronger relationships, as Donna was talking about, and work together with greater intensity and focus than ever before. First Presbyterian Church realizes that we have a long way to go. And we pray that as we regather, the intensity we have seen in this work over the past year will heighten. The work is before us and we can't tire. We have a long way to go for justice. We have a long way to go to repent of and repair our sins that have pushed down, held down siblings of color. We have a long way to go. So let us not tire of the critical work of repairing centuries of injustice and oppression. I am glad that we are not alone, but that we do this work together. I'm glad that we are here doing this and out there doing this. Thank you for letting me speak to you today.
Thanks, Mindy. We appreciate you sharing the work at First Presbyterian. Now we're here for Iman Abdul Wahid as he speaks on this same issue. Abdul?
Yes, good afternoon. And as we say in our religious language, peace to you all. Assalamu alaikum. With God's name, the merciful benefactor, merciful redeemer. First of all, thank you very much for including us in this discussion, conversation today. As an African-American man, I could probably take up all of the time, plus some more time, having lived on this earth for 67 years from Harlem, New York. I certainly have witnessed myself a lot, and I have also studied and learned a lot myself. This issue of racism and white supremacy has certainly affected us consciously and unconsciously in many, many, many ways. When the George Floyd assassination, murder took place last year, our community had a sincere human reaction like every other person, locally, nationally, internationally. Anyone with a conscience had to feel the atrocity that took place. So we immediately said that there's a lot of work that still has to be done. We've been looking at our society, American society in particular, for many years, and we kind of thought that this problem had really abated itself. It had really demised itself. It had really went down. But this situation really showed us. And I use an example that there was when I was growing up as a child in Harlem, New York, one of our favorite sandwiches was spiced ham and cheese. We used to eat that quite regularly. And I remember one day a friend of mine took Pepsi Cola, that strong drink that could remove battery acid off of your battery. So that's a sign for us. But he poured the Pepsi Cola on the spiced ham, and you could see little worms coming out. And I said to myself, when this happened with George Floyd, I said, we had a situation in our country that someone was spilling Pepsi Cola in the atmosphere, and it caused the worms of racism to really feel more emboldened and feel that it can now have public expression for its ugly feelings and hatred towards the people. When we saw this, we said we have to get to work. The public assassination of George Floyd was what we would call the straw that broke the camel's back. You know, this saying, the straw that broke the camel's back, is actually an Arab proverb. And what it simply means is that we know camels, they carry a lot of load. And one extra small thing put on them can annoy them and can really disrupt them. And we felt that the assassination of George Floyd was really the straw that broke the camel's back. It wasn't a minor occurrence. And as a result of that occurrence, it caused a lot of concern in the life of human beings, period. And it was an expression it was an expression of human beings really coming to grips with the life of one human being is just as important as the life of another human being, whether they're Muslim, Christian, Jew, African-American, Caucasian, Hispanic, whether they're male or female, whether they're rich or poor. It's an obligation on us to respect the dignity of every person. So a colleague of mine in Charlotte, North Carolina, we actually talked about this problem. And we said that we have to do something about this. So we began to plan how we can do sessions, how we can do courses on racism, religion, and reconciliation tensions in America was our course. And we taught that at 2 different universities. The immigrant Muslim community, for them, it was a wake-up call because they didn't realize how deep the systemic racism was in this country. But when they saw that public display of the assassination of George Floyd, that awakened in them something about what was still happening in our country. And as a result, they invited us to come to speak to them about this issue. In Islam, education is the #1 priority. So that's how we saw that we can best make a contribution to these concerns, is to bring about more education on racism, more education on white supremacy and its effect on the psychic and the social life of human beings. And a lot of times these things affect human beings in a way that is unbeknown to them. It's subconsciously, subliminally, it affects us. When you look at, again, growing up in New York, downtown, you go downtown Wall Street, you see nothing but big Caucasian images. Psychologically, that impresses something upon you. When you think of the figure that they had, Atlas, carrying the world, that suggests to you, again, to your mind, that it's the Caucasian man, the white man that carries the world. So education for us became a big concern. As a Muslim community, locally, some of the things that the students were doing on campus, they were very, very involved in social justice. Social justice really is an intricate part of Islam. You know, our prophet, prayers and peace be upon him, God revealed to him that we're to stand up for justice, even if it is against our own self. And our own self could be our own people. like my friend and colleague Mindy just got through expressing how Caucasians should be feeling. That's standing up for justice, even if it's against your own self. It could be against your parents. It could be against the rich or the poor. The obligation is to stand up for what is right and what is just. And we believe that social justice is a very important, critical aspect of establishing a beloved or a model community life or ethical society. We have to establish an ethical society, and we believe that stand up for justice for all people will bring about an ethical society. And we have a model of an ethical society that was established during the life of Muhammad the Prophet. A society that's free of religious bias, Christian not thinking they're better than Muslim, Muslim not thinking they're better than Christian, Caucasian not thinking they're better than African Americans or Hispanics, males not thinking they're better than females, the wealthy not thinking they're better than the poor. That's an ethical society, and that's the type of society that we want to see grow. Lastly, I'll say this. As a Muslim community, we see whenever there's wrong, there are three ways that we're obligated. We have an obligation when we see wrong. And what we saw with George Floyd was obviously wrong. But we have an obligation to do three things. That is to change it with our hand. If we have the power, we're to make changes. If we can't change it with our hands, and we did demonstrate power, many of us protested. Protesting is a part of Islam too. We have to protest as well. But also we have to change with our tongue. We have to be advocates and speaking out against any wrong that we see in the society that's affecting a people. And we know that for centuries, African Americans have been looked at as a people that is not seen as human. As we know, our Constitution had us 3/5 of a human being, and that has embedded itself, branded itself in the psychic of Caucasian people to look at African Americans. That's why it was so easy for that police officer to rest his leg in a comfortable position like he was chilling out on the neck of George Floyd. That's because he perceived George Floyd as less than a human being. And as a result of that, we as Muslims see educating about the reality of racism and social justice in our society is very important, and to increase the dignity of all people so that all people can be seen as having human worth and human dignity in our society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abdul. Both Mindy and Abdul emphasize the idea of the dignity of all people. And one thing that we carry with us today is that as we look at what has happened, it has increased what we know about ourselves. And the three things you talk about, our head, our hands, and our tongues, offer an opportunity for us to use our hands, remind us that our heads sometimes get in the way of our hearts and our tongues. And so we thank you for that, Abdul, bringing that to our attention. Rabbi Soffer, we invite you to offer your comments.
Thank you, Reverend Banks, and thank you, Reverend Douglas and Imam Wahid and Reverend Bradford for gathering us and for the invitation to share some of what the Jewish community has been experiencing and how we've been trying to make sense of this, but more importantly, respond and react and proact. I'd say first, every right now my heart is just like moved by the reflections that have been shared so far, but I'm also taken by, I feel very much connected to the very first Hebrew word in the book of Lamentations, which in Hebrew is echa, and it's not a translated word. It doesn't translate well. I actually haven't really tracked down any recent translations because it doesn't, it's just a how. It's a how in the world, it's what and how. It's a combination of what and how, and it's just a lament from the gut. It's said when in Lamentations, looking around, Echa yashva badara ir, how could this city be? How could this polity be just so barren and empty and broken? And that was and is and continues to be the expression as we try to witness and fight these, as Reverend Banks said, these viruses, all of which have intersectional grief vis-a-vis racism and white supremacy and the movement of white nationalism. So Echa, there's this gasp from the gut. That very word in Hebrew also is, if you just, it wasn't until the 9th century that we started adding vowels to those words. So, but those same letters appear in Genesis when God calls out to Adam. He says, Ayeka. God says, Ayeka, which is, where are you? That was, I would say, the core step after just exasperation that we took in the Jewish community, is just this, where are you? Where are you in this? Where are you in this tragedy? And it's taken us a lot, and it's still taking us a lot of deep soul searching in order to think through an answer and reckon with an answer to that question. I remember a couple years ago engaging in an anti-racism community conversation, and we were just trying to get people to talk to each other. And we were staging some small, well-framed, safe conversations within the congregation. And it was, I remember a teenage Asian American in conversation with an elderly man who presented as white. And she said, they were sharing, she expressed some of the challenges of being Asian American in America. And that was new for people in the circle to hear. And the two of them were just talking to each other. And she made a comment about, like, well, did you know this as a white man? And he said, I don't think of myself as a white man, because when I was a kid in Auschwitz, I was not white, and I lived that trauma every single day. You can imagine an emotional response of just hearing we have a Holocaust survivor in conversation who has been in America safer than he ever imagined, and yet still living in the trauma of an unconscionable Nazi regime. And I was just thinking about the huge gap, and the other people in the circle were reflecting on the huge gap. Everyone else in the circle was and defined themselves as white and Jewish, but felt such a gigantic gap between that individual of German descent who had the same skin color as them and me. And we saw something in that circle that was so very real, and that came up again with regard when we were engaging in that introspection, in that where are you question, which is that there are, according to the best studies that we have, 10 to 15% of people who identify as Jewish are Jews of color. If you walk into a synagogue and you look around the pews, you're not going to see 10 to 15% of the community being Jews of color. And this is not just in Judeo Reform congregation, certainly is, but across the Reform Jewish movement, we've been now engaged in a racial justice initiative that is certainly outwardly focused, but also internally focused. This where are you question, and asking the question, why aren't Jews of color affiliating and connecting with synagogues the way that in a proportionate way? And we look around and we're engaged in what we sort of might call racial justice audit. And what are the ways that we're participants in these systems of racism? And that's for most individuals in the community a new question, because there's always been this "I'm not racist" thing, and that ends the conversation. Are you racist? Are you not racist? And that's, so we're in some ways we're learning a new language. In many ways, we're learning a new language for this reckoning, and it's taking totally different form. You know, where do we spend? Where do we? I mean, even into our where do we spend our time? What relationships do we have? Who are our friends? Where do we spend our money? You know, where do we apply our purchasing power? How are we engaged in economic transactions across? Where do we keep our do we keep our money regardless of the economic spectrum? Do we ask what communities are? Is it a black owned bank? This is a new kind of question, but it sort of speaks to the type of thinking that we need to rewire, and that we're trying to get into. I would say this is all in addition to the core belief that if we don't right now go into action, then we don't, I'm speaking as a Jew, then my community doesn't have a right to exist as a Jewish community. That the value proposition of the Jewish people, that we sit around Passover and we read a story that says we were strangers, we were slaves in the land of Egypt long, long ago. And for someone who came out of Auschwitz, someone who came out of the Holocaust, that is not in any way long ago. They are extremely proximate to an atrocity that is far worse than that which we read about in the book of Exodus. But if there's also a teaching in the Passover Haggadah in our liturgy that says that every single one of us, actually it says a human being in every generation, is under the obligation of considering himself or herself as having come out of Egypt, of having come out of, I'll say the Hebrew because it's not Egypt, the nation right now, out of Mitzrayim. And are we seeing ourselves this way? And if we forget to, then we've certainly lost our Judaism. We've lost our way. We have exiled ourselves from our text, from our scripture, from our call from God, from our covenant. And we have to come back home. We have to come back home into this narrative. I was thinking initially when Reverend Bradford asked me to just speak on behalf of the Jewish community, I went to see all the things that we're doing. You know, what have we done? And there are some things that we've done. We've engaged in a racial justice curriculum. We brought a team together across all ages, asking the question, what are we reading to our kids? You know, what are the books that we're reading to our kids? And rather than asking the question, oh, is it a Jewish book? We ask the question, how can we teach Judaism through these narratives and through this book? We're engaged in those works, and there's the public justice work that we're doing. But after a while of thinking about it, I'm back to Eicha. Like I'm right back to that call, because we know that we're not there, and we're nowhere near there. I'll just close by turning to the Yiddish proverb that I think of almost every day to make myself uncomfortable. And it's how do you know if a fish is alive? The Yiddish proverb says, how do you know if a fish is alive? You know it's alive if it swims upstream. We're trying to come back to life. We're trying to come back to life, and it's clear that we have to swim upstream. And finally, I don't think that we're going to figure out how to swim upstream without each other, because in my own personal theology, I'm a Martin Buber addict. And in my own personal theology, I believe the mitzvot, I believe the commandments, I believe what happened at Mount Sinai was ultimately about relationship. And so I am in this moment, and my community, Judeo Reform congregation, we are seeking Sinai. And I feel very blessed to be doing it in this space. So I'll close with that word of gratitude.
Thank you, Rabbi Soffer, Reverend Mindy, and Reverend Iman Wahid. But all of you have said this in so many words. Who is not at the table who is not at the table in our congregation, who's not at the table in our workplaces, who's not at the table in our relationships and our friend groups. It says a lot about who we are and the work that's ahead of us. I invite you before Rector Yancey comes and brings our last presentation, if you have any questions, to go ahead and put those in the chat. So we'll be ready to present that to the group as we finish our time together. So Rector Yancey, we will invite you to offer your words.
Thank you. Thank you. It is a blessing to be here and to hear from my colleagues about the work that's being done. Let me tell you about St. Titus. It is a fairly small Episcopal congregation in Durham. We are 2 blocks from North Carolina Central. We are historically and predominantly a Black congregation. We are very much a place where all are welcome. So it is a mixed congregation today. We certainly have several members who are white, who are active, including part of our clergy. Spencer was surprised us with a visit recently, and you can attest to that. So, and we recognize our diversity as a gift of the Holy Spirit. I say all that to say that we had different reactions to the murder of George Floyd. For all, it was horrific. For some of us, and now I'll speak for myself, the only thing that was shocking was that it was caught on camera. We know that there are some in law enforcement who feel it is their right to brutalize Black bodies. That is the history of this country, and many of us have never forgotten it. But for others, this was a veil lifted, as somebody said, and it was shocking in its brutality and in the officer's confidence that smiling into a camera would not be punished, smiling into a camera as he snuffed out a life. So it was, for all of us then, a wake-up call. The church needed to not just quietly believe in justice for all, that we are all created in the image of God, believe in the equality of all, but we needed to be vocal about it. And so one of the first steps that was taken was that our vestry is our governing body for the church, the congregation, and we commissioned a small group to write a solidarity statement. I think we might say that one of the things George Floyd's murder did was to strengthen our connection to our community. And so this was a statement of solidarity with the community. I will say just one line from it. Therefore, we must answer the clarion call to action that will no longer make peace with oppression and will make real God's command to love our neighbors as ourselves. That statement is on our website. It is adopted by our governing body. It says who we are. And at the same time, that group wrote a litany. It's a call and response form of prayer that we said every Sunday for the season of Pentecost following George Floyd's murder, put it away for Christmas, and we'll bring it out again for a bit. But the last, the last petition there, we enable us, Lord, to discern how to live together, to genuinely love one another, and to effect and embrace the change that is past due. Open our hearts to hear the cries of your people everywhere, cries for mercy, justice, equality, and freedom. These are the cries that you have affirmed from the beginning, that Black lives matter. And so I share that to say, as part of our prayer, we say those words, Black lives matter. There's a sign outside our door, Black lives matter. All of that is kind of brought out in the open. we might have thought maybe it didn't need to be said. Now we know that it does. And so that is part of what that murder has done for us. At the time of the killing, we were already re-envisioning, reworking our mission and vision statements and our value statements. And that was, of course, during COVID. So that was done through surveys and Zoom town hall meetings, but it involved the whole congregation. There was lots of conversation. And what came out was our commitment to justice as being part, a sign of the reign of God, a part of the kingdom. And so this justice work being our responsibility as Christians, as persons who take seriously our call to bring about the reign of God. And so justice is in our mission statement. Justice is in our vision statement, and a definition of justice for all as a core value, one of the 4 core values of the congregation, came out of those ongoing meetings over the summer and fall following that murder. That might have happened in any event, but certainly it was strengthened, that understanding of our call was strengthened by that horrific murder. I will tell you that the entire Episcopal Church, which is more than just in this nation, we have dioceses across the world, our commitment is to becoming beloved community. The head of the Episcopal Church is someone many of you know, Bishop Michael Curry, and he certainly is a driving force in this. And so there are many resources available to us in the church and in our congregation, and many of our folks are involved in several different forms of dismantling racism, training and workshops. I hesitate to take your time to describe the different ones that we are all taking advantage of. Membership in the NAACP, activities for the congregation. Our folks are involved all over and are kind of sharing so that not everyone is in one place or another, but sharing what we hear, ways that we can advocate for those who are treated unjustly, and ways that we can listen. That's part of what I'm doing today, hearing from others, ways that we can do the work that we're called to do. I hesitate to simply go through lists of things. I'd much rather hear questions, but that is a sense of where St. Titus is, very, very much involved in and supporting our community. And I think that might be a good place for me to stop.
Thank you, Rector Stephanie Yancey, for your comments. And thank you to the whole group for offering your perspective and what has been meaningful for your congregations and for yourselves. There's one question in our chat. What constructive role can our congregations take to address this issue in our community? So I will invite anyone to step into that and offer an answer or some idea of what they believe, what we can do. What are some things we can do?
I'd like to also, as we begin this time, recognize 2 of our participants, particularly today. We have Durham District Attorney Satana DeBerry on with us today. And we also have, joining us from Washington, D.C., our former DCIA President, Jimmy Hawkins. It might be good if either of them have particular thoughts about the role and work of faith communities in addressing systemic racism and law enforcement, to offer their 2 cents.
We'd be more than happy to hear from either one of you or both of you. D. Barry?
Well, Spencer called me out. I was here to listen and learn with everyone else. Yeah, so I don't want to take up any of your time, but I just wanted to be here to be in community and to listen to everyone. Imam Wahid I take his counsel, and so I'm happy to hear from everyone. Thanks.
Thank you very much for being here and supporting this effort through our faith communities. Reverend Hawkins, where are you? I don't see you on my screen. There he is.
Yeah, thanks for this moment, Spencer and Reverend Banks. If I had known that I had to cut my camera on, I would have dressed up. But I'm very excited about the conversation and to say to you that as I look at all of the denominations and faith groups that are here, we work well together in DC, and there's a lot of energy right now around racial justice. We have an interfaith coalition with the Washington Interreligious Staff Community, which is basically DCIA's counterpart in DC. And I'm excited about all of the energy around racial justice. And as a Presbyterian, we really are seeing a lot of our presbyteries coming together to talk about ways that some of the issues that you have addressed, such as diversity in our congregations, but not only with our laity, but also with our leadership. And we are doing everything that we can to hold Congress and the current administration keep their feet to the fire to make sure that they follow up on a lot of commitments that have been made. Obviously, it's a new day in DC with the new administration coming in, but we still have a lot of work to do with Congress. Congress is slow to act, and I think they really listen to their constituents. So never fear that your calls, your emails, that they're not making a difference. So please continue to do the work that you're doing. And I'm glad to be here today. And I miss Durham desperately and see a lot of my friends, Reverend Mindy, Imam, it's good to see you again. And I look forward to joining you again. Thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you, Reverend Hawkins. We appreciate you coming in and being a part of us once again for this time. Again, we
I would love to
hear. Go ahead, Mindy.
Yeah, I'm going to call someone out too. Katie Crow, I'm going to give you a little bit of a heads up because I'm about to call on you. But before I do that, I want to connect what I'd like her to share. Katie has works on our Presbytery racial equity team and has put together an audit that a congregation can use so that you, Rabbi Soffer talked about, where is your congregation investing your money? Where is your congregation? What organizations are you supporting? And how many of those organizations are led by people of color, and how many of and how is the work that you are doing, and I talked a little bit about naming and claiming what it is that we are already doing, and how that anti-racism work is part and parcel of that. But if Katie's here and would say something about that audit, I think that'd be great.
Hey, Mindy, I am putting in the chat. Thank you so much for shining a light on that. I'm sending you all, putting it in the chat, the link to that basically anti-whiteness, dismantling whiteness assessment tool that I developed. And I thank you, Mindy, for shining a light on it. I'm going to turn my camera on and you'll see exactly why my camera was off as I balanced kindergartner and various responsibilities today. We are hosting as a Presbytery of New Hope a webinar this coming Thursday at 6:30 p.m. till 8 p.m. on what's called Bringing It Home, really spotlighting two churches in our congregation who very courageously have identified ways to take single steps forward in dismantling racism. One, Hillsborough Presbyterian Church, which is a fairly homogenous congregation that has done some really great heavy lifting, and also Durham Church, which is an intentionally multiracial, multi-ethnic church, and yet also through the course of their life together as beloved community have identified ways to continue to dismantle the hold of white supremacy and to deepen beloved community. And so on our Presbytery of New Hope's racial equity link on our website, you can find out more about that webinar, register for that webinar. But I would say that this tool instrument that Mindy identified and named which is in the chat, is something that you are welcome to use. I would love to talk with you in your congregation about ways that you might implement it or parts of it in a boutique way, how to support you in a boutique way, as this is a boutique conversation depending on your congregation's culture. I would personally love to be a resource to you. I'll put my information in the chat and just want to offer you encouragement that if you just pick out one question from that instrument or read one of the resources in the margins of that document and follow to the extent that as far as you can, wherever that question or that resource leads, just identify that one step that you can take. We're going to do this work, advance this work one step at a time for the rest of our lives. But we are in this together and we are taking steps together. And that's, I believe, kind of how the Holy Spirit moves the needle in our hearts and our systems and our cultures. So thank you, Mindy, for the opportunity to speak to that. Thank you for this marvelous forum and to all the wonderful comments that have been shared.
Thank you, Reverend Katie Crow, and for the work you all are doing. The thing that we have to realize, this is not work that we can stop. It's not a destination. It's the ongoing work of building the kingdom of God. And so, you know, we may feel like we've gotten somewhere, but there's always more room to take, as I say, the next faithful step. How are you taking the next faithful step in your congregation, in your personal life, and to be about this work of building the beloved community? Two quotes from Martin Luther King that I have resonated with over the last, as I was thinking about our time together. The first one says, an individual has not started living until he or she can rise above the narrow confines of his or her individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of humanity. And that is our ongoing work that we're being called to do. And the second one is, we still have a choice to make today: nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. This may well be mankind's last chance to choose between chaos and community. So I invite us to continue to choose community. I invite us to remember that it's not just about me, myself, and I, but about how we're going to live this out together. We have like 4 minutes, but Spencer, is there anything else that you'd like to make us aware of as we close out?
Well, next month, our DCIA forum is going to invite leaders and ministers of congregations to share how they are approaching reopening as vaccinations continue to expand and more public activities become possible, and also to reflect on what some of the long-term changes in their faith community life are appearing at this point as more faith communities begin to regather and figure out what their gathered life is going to look like in the coming months and years. So if you or your minister would be interested in sharing some on that, please reach out to me, let me know. I've just begun contacting a couple of pastors about this, so I'm putting my email address in the chat, and would welcome individuals who would like to share about what changes they've seen in their congregation, what changes they see approaching for their congregation at this point in the pandemic. I want to thank all of our speakers today and thank Donna for her sharing. I will say that I really appreciate Donna's focusing us on what is the next step for us, because I think that for a lot of us who are white and people of faith was one of the awakenings that we had in following George Floyd's murder, that anti-racism is not a destination. It's not a place of rest. It is, as my friends in the recovery community described, the work of sobriety, walking up a down escalator. If you're not actively moving upward and making the effort to take steps forward, the natural force of racism in our culture will simply drag you down. So it's not only what is the next step, but we have to keep taking next steps in order to become the beloved community that God has called us to be. Thank you all for coming today. Certainly on many of our hearts is the pain and the violence being experienced particularly sharply the past days in the Holy Land. We want to pray for our Jewish, Muslim, and Christian brothers and sisters there, that there will be a path to peace and safety and justice and equality together in that land. And so today, let our parting prayers be for peace, shalom, salam, pax vobiscum.
All right.
Thanks for coming. Have a blessed
Thank you. Have a great day.